For the record, I'm Sara Tucker. Your Representative Joan Adam. You were first elected to the House in 1982.
That's correct.
From the 48th District.
Correct.
Atchison. I'd like to start by asking you why you're a Democrat.
I guess truly I'm a Democrat because I grew up in a family that were all Democrats, and that my earliest memories are being in my home with my parents and my aunts and uncles, and everyone was arguing politics, although no one was any other persuasion besides Democrats. So I think that, I'm sure that influenced me greatly, and we always spent a lot of time around the dinner table at night talking about politics and what was going on, and it was just, I think, the major topic that we always gravitated to. So I think that just shaped my view of the world and my interest in public issues and my orientation toward the Democratic Party.
Makes sense to me. How did you come to get into politics then, yourself?
I think, let's see, I came to, I guess the first kinds of things I did was in high school and college. I worked, when I was in college, for a few campaigns. I was in St. Louis University, and so I did a little of that, and always really liked it, kind of got a high when I did that. And then early after I was married in '68, we moved to California, and I worked in a campaign for a gubernatorial candidate. In fact, he was running against Ronald Reagan at the time. Should have worked harder. But at any rate, so I did that. Then soon after that, we moved to Kansas, and I once again started to volunteer in campaigns, and soon was the chair for somebody or other, whoever was running at the state level. And I think a real turning point for me was when I worked in 1974. A person named Martha Keyes ran for the Congress, and I was her county chairperson, and I'm sure she was just desperate for someone in Atchison County, but it was a great situation for me because I got to know her well and really respected her a lot. And I think that was the time, although I'd been working a lot, and I'm sure I'd seen other women in government up to that time, but I think it was at that point that I really began to think, why shouldn't I get into this myself? And so I remember having that kind of revolutionary thought, and wondering why I hadn't had it before. But I think it's an interesting connection when you actually have a woman in a role like that. It does make a real impression on people. And so I think after that, then I didn't really have a strict plan, but I then ran for my city commission a few years later, and then from there came to the legislature.
Okay, so if I've got this right, you indeed did get on the Atchison City Commission in 1979,
Correct.
And were there until 82, and then were elected in 82 for the 83 session. Did you seek out nomination then, or were you asked to be your party's candidate? How did this happen?
I really sought it out. When I ran for the city commission, there were many candidates that ran, and I was elected one of, I guess, 3 at that particular time. I get that every 2 years there was a cycle, and there was, in the next election, there were several people that came in that I began to realize I wasn't going to get any of my agenda accomplished. I was just outvoted in terms of numbers, and they had very radically different ideas than I did. So that made me start to think about the state, and a friend suggested that I get serious about that. And so I just, over a period of 6 or 8 months, started to really think about it and then start to kind of strategize. And so no one sought me to do that. But I kind of, I had some encouragement from some friends, but I'd say mostly it was kind of self-initiated, sort of thinking that was a good place to move. I knew I liked kind of making public decisions and doing that sort of thing, but doing it where I was looked less than fruitful. So I guess I just thought I would find some other level
Now, was this an open seat? Was this,
No, I ran against an incumbent who had been in 4 years,
mm,
and he was a middle-aged man, an insurance salesman. And I think well-liked, but I think I was able to raise some issues in the campaign that, kind of provided a contrast in how we would have operated. And I was helped, I know, by the fact that Governor Carlin had raised the issue of the severance tax at that time, and that became a big issue because he had, although we had no oil and gas, he had opposed that, so that was a pivotal issue.
So now, did you have to struggle for the nomination in the primary, or was that fairly easy?
I had a primary, I think, with at least 2 other people, and there was a man that ran against me in what I would term a vendetta, and I won easily, but it was a very irksome sort of thing. It was a very nasty sort of campaign, and for instance, I'll tell you, this is always my favorite story because it was so awful at the time. It was every day in the paper he would put in a little item that said, "What does Joan Adam think about abortion? Abortion is killing. What does Joan Adam think?" And it was all I could do not to come unglued, but luckily my campaign people told me to be quiet and not address it. But anyway, I won easily.
Now, might I assume that you were taking some sort of choice position?
Not really.
Not really?
I mean, it was not. I mean, I think he just assumed maybe I was a woman who he would characterize as, a little bit liberal, and he thought that would be something that would be very controversial and would cause me problems. There had never been any public discussion of any kind about it. So,
you mentioned your campaign people. How did you campaign? What do you attribute the success of your campaign?
Well, I think that I'm very well organized, and I have had good people work for me, and I would say mostly women. And when I first ran, I think when I was on the city commission, I came to have a group of people that were real supportive of me. And from that group, principally, kind of campaign people kind of came out of that group. And now over the years it's changed, and some people have dropped and added and all of that, but I think that we have a good time campaigning, and there's a real camaraderie, and so it's been, and I've tried to, I always try to get people from different parts of my district and monitor all that kind of thing, but basically there's been a good core group.
Now, I ask this again because of so many different women have been telling us this kind of thing. Sometimes I hear about traditional women's organizations, the women's clubs and so on. Sometimes I hear more about, say, Democratic or Republican organizations. Was there a style of person that works for you? Has that changed?
I don't know that the style, I think it's the core, the number of teachers. Several homemakers, and then just several people with miscellaneous jobs, and several men too, all sometimes teachers, I'm an attorney.
Okay, so sort of across the spectrum.
Okay. I don't think it came, I think there were a few party people that came in, and other clubs I can't think of, but I think in some ways they were related to myself and my experiences and what I had done and the contacts I had made, and a lot of those tended to be somewhat Democratic people, but there was a lot of kind of personal involvement, I think, with me and with issues that I've been.
Makes sense. Did you get very much help from the party organization?
Yes. Yes, I would say. I mean, I'd been very involved in the party in terms of locally an office holder and all, but so they didn't really have a lot of money to offer or anything. It was just a matter of having access to some volunteers and just the general support of the party. So I would say they've always been strong supporters.
Great. Now, you mentioned severance tax issues, and this is just sort of general issues that Carlin raised in '82. Can you think of anything else that really explains why you won and the incumbent lost?
I think there was one issue that I think that I seemed to people to be more articulate and aggressive about stating my opinion and what I do. He was much more laid back. But another issue that was raised, that I raised, was about transportation. That was before there was any kind of transportation highway plan, which the first year I was in, we passed. But there was a road that had been in my district for years and years where the right-of-way had been acquired, but nothing had ever been done. So I raised that issue and talked about the fact that it's been sitting there for so many years, and we need to get organized about what we're going to do about it. The state needs to take a role. And so I think that was something that was kind of a button for people, because it had been sitting there and nothing had been done and really needed to be done.
And you won, and you came down here now almost 10 years ago. When you first came, did you have a real clear plan of how you thought you were going to operate? Did you have committees you wanted to be on? Did you have a style you thought you were going to use?
I think I was very unprepared in terms of some of those issues. I remember, for one, a story I'll tell on myself. I remember calling Fred Weaver, the speaker at the minority leader at the time, and lobbying him about getting on the agriculture committee, which once I got down here, after about 3 months, I realized he probably loved to have somebody who really wanted to be on the ag committee. But, I just didn't have access to people that they told me, what I was going to be like, and it's just a matter of coming down here and finding out myself, and probably not knowing that I should make some contacts and find out. But, I don't think I came down with any clear style. I think they just
kind of learned on the job.
Yeah, right. Threw me in, and I guess I've been swimming.
Well,
okay. And
I would say
drowned.
That's more than a lot of people can say. You were on agriculture. What else? Can you remember what else you ended up on?
Also on transportation, and that related to the issue of the highway. And I had talked to some people down here beforehand, and I knew that when I came down that I was going to be a strong supporter of the highway thing, given whether my district's road was going to be in it, but that was something I would be willing to do. So I really intended to kind of play that issue, because I didn't know that much. And then the other one that I was on at the time was one that was existing then, is no longer existing, but it was computers and technology at that time. That was a big item. So that was kind of a new one. It was a new committee at the time, so I got put on that. So.
We have been asking questions about committees, and what I have come to really be interested in is how important you feel your committee work and committees in general have been in terms of your role here. I hear some people say committees are where it's at, others saying it isn't. How important do you feel committees are to what you've been doing in the legislature?
I would say medium. I think I've done things. I think I really like the committees I'm on. Tax, for instance, I think has been a real central one, and last year I was put on appropriations, and I really like that. And I think that shapes some of the things I've done and some of the things I've talked about. On the other hand, I've also taken some issues related to the environment that I really had no committee connection with, and some other kind of miscellaneous issues like that weren't really related to any committee work I did. So I think I've kind of operated on both.
You are chair of the reapportionment committee.
Right.
My, that must be fun. This year of reapportionment.
It's lovely.
Is that indicative of a certain status and power of yours? Did you get stuck with this thing?
Actually, when I first was elected, I also was on that, and many people who were freshmen. It was the year after, basically. It had been done before, or several years after, but it was not to be done for many years into the future. And I kept it all along, and then at some point I just began to move up, and then in '89 we did an apportionment using a state census, and at that point I was the ranking person, so I mean this has kind of just evolved, and I think it's probably been a function of the fact that I, during that time, was becoming more senior and hopefully looking reasonably competent, and also been getting a little more knowledge about the area, and as we started to get into much more substantive sort of things, in like '88, and at that period we started to talk more about the census and getting ready for the apportionment and all of that. So
it just happened naturally as you, which I suppose leads me to what I really want to ask, which is, somehow out of this, what do you think your job here is? How do you think you go about it? Do you think that being a woman makes any difference in how you do it?
Just in general?
In general,
okay.
Or real specifically?
I think that my job here is to represent my district, and also to have some commitment to the state, and to make some sort of judgments and balance those two roles. At the same time, to do a thing that is a piece of constituents and what they want to do, and also a piece that's my own view of what should be done, and to put all those together in some way that makes sense. The fact that I'm a woman, I think in some ways has been helpful. I guess if I had to come down on one side or the other, I would say that it's been more a handicap than a plus, in terms of just, I think, lack of information about the inside structure and how things really operate, and lack of access to people to get that information often. That's started to change, but I mean, I think I was slow getting started compared to a lot of people that come in with a lot of information about how things work, and they've just been a part of that. I think it's. Is there another question? I think I answered 2 out of 3.
I think you kind of answered all of them. It is interesting how different people formulate the job differently, and whether it seems as though being a woman changes things. It may also be a reflection of the fact that when you came in 1982, there were a lot less women here.
Well, that's been a real positive thing, I think, to see that develop, because I know when I came in, there were, I think, something like 17 in the House, but even then that wasn't really enough of a group to be a force of any kind, and over the years, as we've become not necessarily a majority on committees, but such a bulk of people on any committee that, and not that we always agree with each other totally, but I think we've just been taken more seriously. I personally don't see a lot of people that play games or deny us access to things. We're just too big a group, and our votes are needed, and I think in many ways it's a very competent sort of group, and that's been helpful in terms of kind of making a place for ourselves. So that's been encouraging, I think.
If you could describe how you learned to do your job better and better here, would you say it was by having mentors, by having role models, not by doing that? How have you learned to do your job?
I think a combination. I think I've watched other people. I think I've had a few mentors, not as many as I would like, but I've had some.
Would you list a couple?
Oh, I think I've had. I just had lunch with somebody in research that over the last few years is helpful to me in terms of information or her opinion about things I really respect, and I think she has a good insight into things. and then there's another legislator that I think it's just kind of comes from a district similar to mine, and I think he's been helpful in terms of kind of directing me and helping me figure out things, and another staff member on the Democratic side that's been, I think I can consult with. So.
That's interesting to me that you have mentioned, I think, both legislators and non-legislators when you talk about matters, which makes a lot of sense to me. If you were to look back over your career so far, are there some issues or debates or controversies or bills or victories or even defeats that seem to you particularly memorable that you've been involved in?
Well, I think my first year, the highway bill, I mean, I think for anybody that was here, it was dramatic. I'm not sure. I'm sure as a freshman it was dramatic because it was exciting, but it was, of course, a last-minute agreement, and we had stayed on a Sunday, and I felt very good because I knew my road was in this bill, and I was going to get worked on soon, and so it seemed like a great victory, so that one sticks in my mind. I think in terms of defeats, one of them has been the classification amendment. I had voted against it at the time we initially had it, and I had a concern about how it was going to work out, and then my fears have been realized in terms of what the shift of taxes has meant to people, and my way of thinking has not been helpful to a common person around the state. And that's just been very hard to change, and I've spent a lot of time, several years, trying to get that. It always takes a 2/3 vote, so it's really hard to get that kind of thing. For whatever, there's a lot of people now that, for various reasons, are very supportive of it. And so that's, I think, in terms of defeats or issues that didn't go my way, that would stick out in my mind. Then I think other victories are just little personal bills that I've had that I was real pleased with that were passed, that that I now see being implemented, that pleased is making a little small change in something or other. So those things are.
Do you plan to continue running for election in the legislature? Is this something you're enjoying doing and see yourself continuing with?
Yes, I think that I'm beginning to feel like I need to make a change just for kind of a new challenge, and I'm giving some thought to running for the Senate and possibly looking for some administrative job, some kind of thing like that. So I suspect that I may not run again for the House, but I would either run for the Senate or run look at a state job of some sort.
A state job, what would be the appeal versus being in the legislature?
Well, there would be, money would be an appeal, as my husband keeps telling me. I think a lot of the policy issue stuff would still be there. That's, I think, my core interest. I think I would very, very much miss the kind of connection you have with voters and kind of keeping that connection going. And I mean, I should probably use the word game, but it's some way bringing them along to the extent that you need to, and getting all of that integrated so you can be pleased with your votes and feel like they've been positive, but still keep your voters reasonably happy and well informed, and in your little circle, making the process sort of work.
Yes.
And I like that, and I know that I would miss that, so I'm going to think about it carefully before I leave it.
Yeah. I always thought as I got older things would get easier, but I was clearly wrong. I would like to at least get started on asking the other half of this, which is your personal life, and I want to emphasize I'm not trying to pry beyond where you want me to go. Really not. But I am awfully interested where the kind of personality in women comes from that is comfortable doing this, and how in the world any adult human being manages to balance the life of a legislator with family. So, could you tell me about your birth family, where you grew up, what sorts of parents you had, and so on?
I grew up in Illinois on a farm. My father farmed. There were 4 of us in the family. I had a twin brother, so he and I were the youngest. We had an older brother and my older sister, who's about 2 years older than I am. And by the way, is a delegate, which is the same as a representative in the state of Maryland.
How very interesting.
So you can see there's something in our water or something that happened. At any rate, we had, I think, a traditional upbringing. I think one thing that I've already mentioned to you is the family focus on politics. And my mother especially was very interested in that, I think even more than my father, although he served on the school board for several years. And I'm sure that my mother's interest in politics was a real important thing, because I think it, as a woman, as a girl growing up, that seemed like a natural thing, and I just think it encouraged my interest in it and made it seem okay. And
you never grew up thinking women didn't do things, then, I take it.
Well, I certainly do. I think that we had kind of the typical, probably, rules about who did what. For instance, my sister and I stayed in the house and did housework with my mother, and the boys went out and worked with my father. And I remember having a real problem with that when I was little and allowed to go out with my father. And then all at once I got to be a certain age and I was supposed to stay in the house. And I guess ultimately I got used to it. But I've never liked housework, though. That's probably my way of rebelling.
And you were born in 1944, so we're describing, I guess, the 1950s. Well, indeed.
So I mean, all of my aunts and the women I knew around me were homemakers and did not, I can't think of hardly anyone that had careers or had any other outside thing, but they were very active women who were interested in lots of things. That was true of my aunts. My mother had about 7 sisters, and they were all very close to our home. And they were, I think they had the same kind of dynamic sort of interest in things. It was real positive for me. And then I went away to high school, to a boarding school. I was reading Catholic, and that was kind of there was not a Catholic school close by, and that was kind of, so I went. It was about a 3-hour drive, and I loved boarding school. There was maybe 50 girls in my class, and it was I think it was just the closeness with the other girls, and we had a real similar interest in things, and the nuns were fun, and they were, I'm sure, good role models for us. They were interested in lots of different things. And, so I've always thought that was a positive part.
Where did you go to boarding school?
It was Nauvoo, Illinois. What now? Should I go on to college?
Not necessarily. You went to St. Louis University, got a BA in English. Got married 2 years after graduation, and your husband is now, I see, employed at Kansas City International Airport.
He's a commercial pilot with TWA.
Okay. So, you got married, you became a housewife, and a mother, or what happened?
Kind of. We lived in the East Coast for a year, and then we moved to the West Coast for about 3 years. And during that time, I had my older son in 1971. And I think before I had my son, I did substitute teaching, and nothing that was a real commitment to any kind of career path. And then he came along, and then soon after that, we moved to Kansas, and my second son was born in 1974. I mean, what I was going to do was always a great concern to me. I mean, I passed through the years of the 60s and feminism and all of that, and so I was feeling, I think, worry and concern and not a lot of conflict about what I would do, and kind of not, I'm sure, not having a very good handle on career options, and feeling like a lot of them closed off. And at any rate, my effort to cope with this, I went part-time to KU to get my degree in public administration, and that was, I mean, I enjoyed it. It was, I guess I didn't always see quite where I was going with it, but at any rate, I did that, and then I think when I was doing that, I mean, I guess I went into it thinking I would go into city management or some kind of thing like that, and at the same time at home I was getting involved in campaigns and kind of seeing that connection with, elections and voting, and I began to think I wanted to do that more than do the administrative sort of thing. So I guess that's when I started to run for the city commission and kind of took that path. More recently now, in my lifelong attempt to find my true spot, went back to law school in probably 83 or 84 at Washburn and got my degree in 87. And so I've been practicing law since about 88.
That's a fair achievement. If you went back to law school, at Washburn, which is not your residence, worked in the legislature, and I take it did law school more than half time. That must have been pretty intensive years. You're nodding. Why did feminism, or whatever, if you're married, you have children, there's certainly no absolute need to go out and do all of this. Can you explain to me why it is you have felt a need to do all these things?
I guess it is, just some sense of needing to make a contribution and making some way validating my own values that I think were, strong values about the system, and I don't know, just the whole process of.
Here we go again. You, if I've got this all straight, have one husband, yes, Earl, who is a pilot and is at KCI. You have two children, one of whom was born in 72?
71.
71.
And one in 74.
And one in 74. So when you started with the legislature, you had an 8-year-old child. How did you manage it then? Marriage, family, and so on?
No secret method, just by the seat of my pants. I mean, I just did it. I think my husband, by that time, after numerous discussions, was resigned to the fact that I was going to want to do this, and that was going to be real important. And fortunately, he's a very good parent, and it's an easy role for him to fill, I think. And so he was very cooperative in terms of helping out and doing that kind of thing. And then I just filled in as best I could, with babysitters or whatever, and tried to, to some extent, the legislative stuff, some of it you can structure in the ways you want, and so I tried to do that whenever I could, so that I didn't interfere with their schedules. And I think that I did a fairly good job. I certainly miss things that they, I'm sure, would prefer to have me there, but I don't think it was egregious, and so I think it was just trying to get through the situation without, a lot of good support systems there to help me, with the exception of my husband, who was, I think, always helpful.
Now, did you commute every day? Did you stay down here during the week?
I usually stay down, from the beginning, I stayed down like 2 days a week, or sometimes 1 day, sometimes 3 days, but, and stayed at a friend's home, another legislator that I came in with, and then my husband and I would try to work it out with his schedule. He knows his schedule a month in advance, so I would know when he was going to be there, and so we try to have somebody with the kids when neither one of us could be, but a lot of times one or the other of us could be there. So that's how we did that. And
sounds tight.
Yeah, we were always very glad when the session was over and we could stop this ridiculous system. So.
Now, for the record, your commute from Atchison is how many miles about?
It's about 55 miles. It takes about an hour.
On pretty good highway, but this is Kansas. So.
That's right.
Yes,
you
indeed.
got it.
Again, I certainly don't want to go into your finances more than you want me to. It's expensive, I think, for most legislators. How do you manage to make enough money as a lawyer? Or what do you do about your finances to make it possible to be here?
I think I've been fortunate to have, my husband doesn't make millions, but he makes a good salary and it's been fairly steady, slightly increasing salary. So that's certainly been a help. I guess we were somewhat helped by the fact that he probably felt that, I might not work. We came into a marriage with the idea that he would be the main caretaker and I would be, or wage earner, and I would be the caretaker. So, there has not been an expectation that I'd go out and start making 50 or 80,000, which is fortunate because I indeed have not done that. So I think there is a financial part of this that's, even in practicing law, I think I've not ever heard any other attorney say anything different, that it's very difficult for your practice to be doing this. It's just, it's hard on your clients, it's hard on your partners, it just doesn't work very well. And
how do you practice law? What form do you practice in? Are you in a partnership or are you by yourself?
Just work with two other attorneys. I'm not really a partner, but just kind of associate
out of the same facilities.
Office and use the same secretaries. And they are very easy to get along with, and wanted me in the group knowing what my situation was going to be. So I think it's been positive.
Has your being in the legislature changed your own abilities, your own attitude, your own outlook, the way other people see you? What is the impact on you of being in the legislature?
Oh, I'm sure it has. I don't know how it would compare with being in some other, job. I think I've developed some abilities and, over time that have been helpful, and I guess my outlook is I'm not sure what to say about my outlook. I think it's maybe what I would have no matter what I was doing in terms of things I'm interested in and care about, and the things I devote my time to. And but it's allowed me to kind of further that interest that I have, which has been, I think it's true to say that if I had not had that, I feel like there was some piece missing. And so.
How hard on your family has it been, do you think? Has it given them a lot?
I hope that it has. I guess my boys don't have quite as much interest in politics as I would like, and they have that same kind of feeling of being turned off to some degree. Not totally, but and I think in time it will generate itself again. But I know that when I first ran for the city commission, when my boys would be 8 and 5. And even though the city commission required like one meeting every 2 weeks, this was a big topic of conversation, was how could I manage this with these two boys. So, I mean, my answer was always, and it was true at the time, and I still think it's true, is that it had been a strong value in my family that had been passed on to me, and that I continued to have that value, and I, with or without that office, I would want to pass that value on to them. And I think this, being involved in that, allowed me to do that, and I thought they would be the better for that. And, so, I mean, I think that has been true. Even though there have been hardships on their part, I mean, I think it's made them realize that everyone moves over a little bit for someone else in terms of what they want to do, and I certainly think that male beings need to know that they need to move over, and so they learn that early on. That seems good to me.
Where do you see politics, and I suppose especially women in politics, going in the future?
I think continuing in terms of numbers of women, and I think it will continue, and they'll continue to make strides. And I believe in that theory of more people in Congress because there's more people in the state legislatures, and that it's just a building thing. And I think that women have done a good job of coming into the system and seeming competent and being willing to pull their weight, and I think they've allayed a lot of fears about, whatever. So I think it's going to continue in the same direction, just get stronger.
Do you think a lot of women in politics has or will change politics?
Yes. I guess maybe not as dramatically as, I sometimes would like to think, but I think there is a real difference in how women approach problems and approach groups. And I just spoke yesterday at the Y, just briefly. They had some other legislator invited. And I know last summer when I was back in Washington in a meeting, there were several women there, 2 other women who were chairs of their House apportionment committees. And I think there were 2 others in the states, and I think this year is the first time there have been any women to chair that committee. So it was my comment that I thought it would be interesting to look at those states and see if there was any real difference in how the process went, because I don't think women tend to do that thing of trying to slam stuff down on other people, and I think they want to negotiate and make everything be okay for everyone, and for good or ill. I'm not sure that's always the best system, but it certainly takes a lot longer, I'm finding. But at any rate, I think there are differences, and I think that's been very positive. I think you see it in the legislature. I think there's, it's just, I would, it seems to me more human. I guess that's because I'm a female, and that seems like what human is, but
well, maybe there need to be different kinds of human. We don't need just one gender's version of human.
And issue-wise, too, I think there's been a clear move to discuss things that are important to women, and
such as
rape laws, child care, SRS issues related to children, all of those kinds of things.
What used to be called women's issues.
That's right.
Is there anything I should have asked? Is there anything you would like to say here at the end for the record?
No, I can't think of anything. Don't cover it at all.